James walked along the bustling avenue of Manhattan, his mind swirling with thoughts. Success in business had brought him fortune, but it didn't fill the void that had been growing in his chest since the tragedy that forever changed his life. As his footsteps echoed on the sidewalk, he stumbled upon a scene that seized his heart. At the curb, a small, dirty, thin boy was desperately rummaging through the trash, searching for something to ease his hunger. The contrast between the opulence of the surrounding buildings and the misery of that child was overwhelming. James felt a tightness in his chest, a mix of compassion and pain, as he watched the boy pull out a piece of moldy bread and bite into it ravenously. Why does he have to endure this? James thought as painful memories flooded his mind. Years ago, he too had dreamed of being a father. He remembered Emily's radiant face, his girlfriend, announcing she was pregnant. But that happiness was tragically cut short by an argument that ended in a fatal car accident. Emily and the baby they were expecting were taken away from him in the blink of an eye, leaving behind a black hole of pain and guilt that he had carried ever since. James approached the boy slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to help, but he didn't know how. The sight of the boy brought him back to his own despair, to that dark night when he lost everything. Every step towards the boy was a struggle against the tears threatening to fall. "Hey kid," he called out, his voice trembling. The boy looked up, his big, frightened eyes meeting James. For a moment, everything else disappeared. There was only that gaze, filled with suffering and innocence. It was as if the universe was giving him a second chance to do something right. "Are you hungry?" James asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The boy nodded, not saying a word. The expression on his face was a mix of hope and distrust. James felt a lump in his throat. How could such a small child already know so much pain? He bought food from a nearby street cart and handed it to the boy, watching as he devoured each piece with an urgency that broke his heart even more. As the boy ate, James couldn't help but wonder about his life, about how he had ended up in this situation. Who was he? Where were his parents? The pain James felt was almost unbearable. He wanted to scream, to cry, to hug the boy and tell him everything would be okay. But he knew life was more complicated than that. The weight of the past, the unresolved grief, and the overwhelming guilt of not being able to save Emily and their child consumed him. James looked up at the darkening sky and made a decision. He couldn't change the past, but maybe he could do something to change the boy's future. He didn't know how, but he was determined to try. The sight of that boy scavenging for food in the trash had awakened something in him, a flame of hope and purpose that he thought he had lost forever. "What's your name?" he asked gently, with a glimmer of determination in his eyes. "Lucas," the boy replied, his voice low and fragile. "Lucas, I'm James," he said, extending his hand. "Let's find a way to help you." And so, amidst the chaos of the big city, began a journey of redemption and hope, a journey that would lead James to confront his demons, to deal with the accumulated pain, and perhaps to find a new reason to live. As they walked together, James felt the weight of his own scars, but also the lightness of a new possibility. And in that moment he knew that despite all the pain, there was still room for a little hope. As James and Lucas walked together through the streets of Manhattan, James's heart was heavy, yet it pulsed with a newfound determination. He had silently vowed to himself that he wouldn't let Lucas go back to that miserable life without trying to change something. Upon reaching James's apartment, a spacious yet empty place, Lucas looked around with wide eyes. James guided him to the kitchen and prepared a decent meal, watching the boy eat with an eagerness that broke his heart. After Lucas finished eating, James led him to the couch, sitting down beside him. "Lucas, I want to know more about you," he said gently. "Where do you live? Who takes care of you?" Lucas's eyes, once bright with the meal, darkened. He lowered his head, nervously fidgeting with his fingers. "I live with my grandpa," he murmured. He's not well. He uses drugs and sometimes..." He gets angry. James felt a tightening in his chest. Lucas's words hit him like a wave of sadness. He knew the pain of losing someone, but he had never imagined such a young child going through it. "And your parents?" he asked carefully. Lucas shrugged. "My mom died when I was little. I never knew my dad." The revelation brought a lump to James's throat. The weight of Lucas's suffering added to his own, creating a shared pain that was almost unbearable. But it also brought a renewed determination. He needed to do something for this boy. As Lucas drifted off to sleep on the couch, exhausted, James sat at the kitchen table, lost in thought. The sight of Lucas, so vulnerable and helpless, brought back painful memories. He remembered Emily, her radiant smile, the way her eyes sparkled when she talked about their future and the baby. He recalled the argument they had on the night of the accident, words spoken in the heat of the moment that could never be taken back. The guilt consumed him. He believed that somehow the tragedy had been his fault. James vividly remembered that night. The pouring rain, the blinding headlights, the screeching sound of metal colliding. He could never erase the image of Emily's face, the expression of terror in her final moments. He felt hot tears streaming down his face. It was a pain that never diminished, that always came back to haunt him in the most unexpected moments. He looked at Lucas sleeping peacefully and felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe by helping Lucas he could find some relief for his own pain. He decided that from that moment on, he would do everything in his power to change the boy's life. In the following days, James began discreetly investigating Lucas's situation. He discovered that the boy's grandfather was a known addict, often involved in criminal activities. The environment Lucas lived in was dangerous and unstable. Each discovery made James's heart ache more, increasing his determination to protect the boy. James started visiting Lucas regularly, bringing food and gifts. With each visit, the bond between them grew stronger. Lucas began to trust James, to see him as a protective figure. But the shadow of James's past never left him. On silent nights when Lucas slept, James was haunted by nightmares of the accident, memories of Emily, and overwhelming guilt. On one of those nights, as he watched Lucas sleep, James wondered if he would ever be able to forgive himself. He remembered Emily's words, her desire to start a family, and felt the sharp pain of loss. The emptiness in his heart seemed insurmountable. But then he looked at Lucas and realized that perhaps by helping that boy, he could find some meaning in his own devastated life. The decision was made. He would do everything to protect Lucas, to give him a chance at a better life. Even if it meant facing his own demons, revisiting his most painful memories, and perhaps finding a way to forgive himself. And so, as the moon shone over Manhattan, James committed to a new journey. A journey of redemption, of facing his past, and above all, of offering Lucas the future he himself had lost. Each step would be painful, each memory a challenge, but he was determined to move forward. For Lucas, and perhaps for himself. In the following weeks, James became a constant presence in Lucas's life. Each visit to Lucas's grandfather's small apartment revealed more about the harsh reality the boy faced. The grandfather, often intoxicated and altered by drugs, was a threatening and unpredictable figure. James felt a mix of anger and despair every time he saw Lucas cowering in a corner, trying to become invisible to avoid his grandfather's wrath. One night, as James sat on the couch, watching Lucas play with a toy car he had brought, a piercing scream echoed through the apartment. Lucas's grandfather was in one of his episodes, yelling insults and overturning furniture. Lucas ran to hide behind James, trembling with fear. James held Lucas tightly, his heart racing and his mind swirling. He knew he couldn't passively watch anymore. The situation was unsustainable. When the grandfather finally collapsed on the floor, unconscious, James seized the opportunity to take Lucas to his car. With each step, he felt the weight of responsibility growing, but also the determination to protect the boy at any cost. In the car, as he drove towards his apartment, James looked at Lucas, who was huddled in the passenger seat, eyes red from tears. "Lucas, I won't let anything bad happen to you," he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "You're safe with me." Lucas nodded, but the pain and fear in his eyes were palpable. James felt his heart tighten. He knew that words wouldn't be enough. He needed actions, something concrete to ensure Lucas's safety. Upon arriving at the apartment, James prepared an improvised bed for Lucas in the guest room. As the boys settled in, James made his way to the balcony, his gaze lost in the nighttime horizon. The weight of Emily's memories and the baby he never knew mixed with the urgency of protecting Lucas. Silent tears streamed down his face as he struggled against the feeling of helplessness. That night, James couldn't sleep. The images of Lucas's grandfather, the boy's frightened expression, and the ghosts of his own past formed a whirlwind in his mind. He decided he needed help. He couldn't do this alone. The next morning, while Lucas still slept, James picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. The line rang several times before it was answered. "Hello." The familiar voice of Sarah, Emily's friend, echoed through the phone. "Sarah, it's me, James," he said, his voice trembling. "I need your help." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. "James, it's good to hear your voice," Sarah replied with a mix of surprise and caution. "What happened?" James told her everything. About Lucas, the addicted grandfather, and the desperate need to protect the boy. As he spoke, he felt the emotional barrier between him and Sarah begin to crumble. She listened attentively, without interrupting, and when he finished, there was a determination in her voice that brought a thread of hope to James. "I'll help you, James," Sarah said. "For Lucas. And for you." Sarah's arrival brought immediate relief. She had experience with children in risky situations, something James lacked. Together, they began planning the next steps. James knew the battle would be difficult and long, but now with Sarah by his side, he felt that maybe he had a chance. Each day brought new challenges. The regular visits from social workers, the struggle to prove that he was a stable figure in Lucas's life, and the confrontations with the boy's grandfather, who wasn't willing to give him up easily. But each challenge also strengthened the bond between James and Lucas, and between James and Sarah. On a cold afternoon, while Lucas was at school, James and Sarah had a deep conversation. Sitting in the living room, they talked about the past, about Emily, and about the pain they both carried. Sarah revealed that she had always felt something for James, but never had the courage to confess. James, in turn, spoke about the emptiness he felt since Emily's death, and how Lucas had brought a new hope into his life. It was an emotional conversation, leaving them both with tears in their eyes. But it was also a moment of healing. For James, it was a step towards forgiving himself and accepting that, despite all the pain, there was still a chance for happiness. As weeks turned into months, James and Lucas's relationship continued to strengthen. But every progress was accompanied by new challenges and tensions that threatened to destabilize the delicate balance James struggled to maintain. One night, James was sitting at the kitchen table, reviewing legal documents and trying to prepare for the upcoming hearing about Lucas's temporary custody. His eyes were tired, and the weight of responsibility seemed heavier with each passing day. Suddenly, he heard a strange noise coming from Lucas's room. Rushing there, he found the boy trembling and sweating, eyes wide with fear. "Lucas, what happened?" James asked, kneeling beside the bed. "I had a nightmare," Lucas whispered, his voice trembling. "Grandpa was angry, and you weren't there to protect me." James felt a tightness in his chest. He pulled Lucas into a tight hug, feeling the boy's tears wetting his shirt. "I'm here now, Lucas, and I'll always be here for you." That night, James sat by Lucas's bedside until he fell asleep again. Watching the boy sleep, he felt a mixture of love and pain so intense it almost suffocated him. It was like reliving the loss of Emily and their baby, But this time he had the chance to do things differently. He couldn't fail again. The next morning, Sarah arrived with coffee and a smile, but her eyes reflected the same concern James felt. "How is he?" she asked, watching Lucas play in the living room. "Better, I think. But these nightmares are getting worse," James replied, rubbing his temples. "I'm trying my best, but I feel like it's not enough." Sarah placed her hand over his, conveying silent comfort. "You're doing more than enough, James, and you're not alone in this." Sarah's words were a balm, but James knew the battle was far from over. He decided he needed to take more drastic measures to ensure Lucas's safety. He talked to a lawyer specializing in custody cases and began gathering evidence of the deplorable conditions in which Lucas lived with his grandfather. One afternoon, while James and Lucas were strolling in the park, the boy suddenly stopped and looked at James with a seriousness beyond his years. "Are you going to leave me too, James? Like my mom did?" The question was like a punch to the stomach. James knelt down to be at eye level with Lucas, feeling tears welling up in his eyes.
"No, Lucas.
I will never leave you. Promise. I'll do everything I can to protect you and give you the life you deserve." Lucas hugged James tightly, and in that moment James felt a renewed determination. He knew he couldn't change the past, but he could fight for Lucas's future. And he would do it with all the strength he had. The next day, as James prepared breakfast, the phone rang. It was the lawyer, bringing news that would shake James and Lucas's fragile world. "James, we need to talk. We have a serious problem," the lawyer said, with a tone that made James's heart race. They met at the lawyer's office, where James learned that Lucas's grandfather had hired a lawyer and was fighting to regain custody of the boy. He claimed that James was interfering with his family and threatened to further complicate the situation. James felt the ground open up beneath his feet. Tears of frustration and fear burned in his eyes. "He can't do this," he murmured almost to himself. "He can't take Lucas away from me. We'll fight this," the lawyer assured him. "But you need to be prepared. This is going to be a tough battle." James returned home that night, feeling more exhausted and defeated than ever. He sat on the couch, head in his hands, trying to find the strength to go on. He felt Lucas's presence beside him and looked up to find the boy's big, trusting eyes. "Are we going to be okay, James?" Lucas asked, his voice soft and hopeful. James took a deep breath, trying to convey confidence he barely felt. "Yes, Lucas. We're going to be okay. We'll fight together, and we won't give up." The night dragged on slowly, and James wondered how he would bear the weight of yet another battle. Lucas's eyes, filled with hope and fear, kept him grounded, but the mounting tension was palpable. He knew he needed more help. Sarah's phone rang, and she immediately answered upon hearing the urgency in James's voice. "Sarah, he's trying to regain custody of Lucas." "I don't know what to do," James said, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and despair. "I'll be there in 10 minutes, Sarah replied without hesitation. While waiting, James tried to stay calm to avoid alarming Lucas. They played a board game, but James's mind was elsewhere, lost in a sea of uncertainties. When the doorbell finally rang, it was a relief, a reminder that he wasn't alone in this fight. Sarah entered, bringing with her a palpable energy of determination. "Let's sit down and figure out a plan," she said, taking James's hand and squeezing it tightly. They spent hours discussing strategies, discussing every detail that could help keep Lucas safe. Sarah made calls to contacts in social services, trying to garner support. James felt a glimmer of hope growing again, but the fear of the unknown still loomed over them. One morning, as James was preparing breakfast, he heard a loud knock on the door. His heart raced. He opened the door to find 2 policemen outside. "Mr. James, we have a warrant to search your residence," one of the officers said, showing the document. James felt panic rising. "This must be a mistake. I haven't done anything wrong," he said, trying to remain calm. "We're just following orders," the officer replied. As the officer searched his home, a frightened Lucas ran to his room. James followed, trying to comfort him, but the pain and anxiety were clear in his eyes. "It's going to be okay, Lucas. I promise," he said, though he wasn't sure of anything in that moment. Hours later, the officers left, finding nothing incriminating. But the sense of invasion left James devastated. He sat on the couch, head in his hands, feeling powerless. Sarah found him there, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "We'll overcome this, James. We won't let him break us." The hearing for temporary custody was fast approaching. Each day was a struggle to keep hope alive. James and Sarah spent nights reviewing documents, preparing testimonies, and trying to anticipate every move of Lucas's grandfather's lawyer. On the day of the hearing, the courtroom was filled with tension. James held Lucas's hand tightly as they waited to be called. When they finally entered the hearing room, Lucas's grandfather was already there, with a defiant look. James felt a knot in his stomach, but he stood firm. The testimonies began, each word weighing like lead. James spoke honestly about his relationship with Lucas, about the dangerous environment the boy lived in before, and about his desire to provide a safe and loving life for him. Sarah corroborated everything, adding her own testimony about the living conditions and the unstable behavior of Lucas's grandfather. When it was the grandfather's turn, he presented a distorted image of James, claiming that he was trying to tear their family apart and had no right to keep Lucas. The words cut James deeply, but he didn't let it show. The legal battle was in full swing, and he knew that every word counted. After hours of tense testimonies and counter-arguments, the judge announced that he needed time to deliberate. The hearing was adjourned to the next week, leaving everyone in a state of unbearable suspense. Back at the apartment, James and Lucas sat in silence. Lucas finally broke the silence, his voice small and trembling. "James, do you think the judge will send me back to Grandpa?" James looked at Lucas, feeling a deep pain in his chest. "Lucas, I don't know what will happen, but I promise I'll fight for you with everything I have. I won't give up on you." As the night wore on, James and Sarah continued to plan, to search for new evidence, to make calls. Every step was a small victory, but the battle was far from over. The tension was constant, the pain of the past and the fear of the future intertwined, but James's determination never wavered. He knew he was in a fight not only for Lucas's future, but also for his own redemption. And in that fight he found a strength he never knew he had. Hope was alive, albeit fragile, and he clung to it with all his might. James could hardly sleep that week. Anxiety gnawed at every fiber of his being, and nightmares were constant. He saw Emily in his dreams, always with that sad smile, always out of reach. He saw Lucas being torn from his arms, calling for help. And above all, he felt guilt and helplessness weighing like a leaden cloak on his shoulders. Sarah was by his side every moment, a steady and comforting presence. She did what she could to help James prepare for the upcoming hearing, but also to maintain normalcy for Lucas. They took walks in the park, played board games, and Sarah even taught Lucas to cook some simple dishes. Every moment of normalcy was a small victory, a reminder that there was something worth fighting for. One day, while James was at the lawyer's office, he received an urgent call from Sarah. "James, you need to come home now. Something happened to Lucas." James's heart raced. He grabbed his keys and ran out. Upon arriving home, he found Sarah in the hallway, her eyes filled with concern. "He's in the room." It was his grandfather. He showed up out of nowhere and, "Lucas is very scared." James entered the room and saw Lucas huddled in the corner of the bed, his eyes red from crying. He approached slowly, trying not to frighten him even more. "Lucas, it's me, James. It's okay. I'm here." Lucas looked at him, his eyes filled with fear and pain. "He said he's going to take me back. He said he's going to make you disappear." James felt intense anger growing inside him, but he knew he needed to be strong for Lucas. "No one's going to take you back, Lucas. Promise. We're in this together." He held Lucas until the boy stopped trembling, feeling his fragility like an unbearable weight. After Lucas fell asleep, James left the room, finding Sarah in the hallway. "We need to make sure this doesn't happen again," he said, his voice firm. Sarah nodded. "I'll call the police and report the incident. We need a restraining order against Lucas's grandfather." As Sarah made the calls, James sat in the living room trying to process everything. The threatening presence of Lucas's grandfather was a constant reminder of how fragile the security he was trying to build for the boy was. Anger and helplessness mingled, creating a storm within him. That night, as Lucas slept on the couch next to Sarah, James looked out at the darkness of the city through the window. The fight seemed endless, and the fear of failure was paralyzing. But every look at Lucas, every shy smile, every moment of trust renewed his determination. The restraining order was quickly granted, but James knew it was only a temporary measure. The real battle was in the courtroom, where he would have to prove he was the best option for Lucas's custody. Sarah's support was invaluable, but the pressure mounted with each passing day. On the morning of the new hearing, James felt more nervous than ever. He dressed carefully, trying to convey a confidence he didn't feel. Before they left, he knelt before Lucas, holding his small hands. "Today is an important day, Lucas. I want you to know that no matter what happens, I'll always be here for you." Lucas looked at him, his eyes reflecting a mix of hope and fear. "I believe in you, James," he said, his voice trembling. In the courtroom, tension was palpable. Lucas's grandfather's lawyer presented aggressive arguments, trying to paint James as a stranger who was trying to steal a child from his family. Every word was like a blow, but James stood firm. When it was James's turn to speak, he stood up, his heart pounding. He looked at the judge, then at Lucas, and began to tell his story. He spoke about the night he found Lucas, about the miserable life the boy lived with his grandfather, and about the love and hope the boy had brought into his life. As he spoke, he saw tears in the eyes of some people in the room. He felt his own voice tremble with emotion, but he continued, "Lucas is like a son to me. I can't change that. And I'll do everything in my power to protect him and give him the life he deserves." When he finished, the silence in the room was deafening. The judge looked at James for a long moment before retiring to deliberate. The wait was agonizing, each second stretching out like an eternity. Finally, the judge returned. James felt his heart race as he began to speak. "After considering all the testimonies and evidence presented, I have decided to grant temporary custody of Lucas to James." James felt tears fill his eyes as he pulled Lucas into a tight hug. The relief was overwhelming, but he knew this victory was only the beginning. The fight for permanent custody lay ahead, and he would need all the strength and support he could find. That night, back at the apartment, James, Sarah, and Lucas sat together, feeling for the first time a glimpse of real hope. As Lucas played on the floor, James looked at Sarah, holding her hand tightly. "We'll make it, Sarah. For Lucas, we'll make it." Sarah smiled, squeezing his hand. "Yes, James. We'll make it. Together." James and Sarah knew that, despite the temporary victory, the real battle for Lucas's permanent custody was just beginning. Days turned into a marathon of meetings with lawyers, visits from social workers, and consultations with child therapists to help Lucas deal with the trauma of his past. One night, after one of these long meetings, James found Lucas sitting alone on the balcony, gazing up at the stars. He approached slowly and sat down beside the boy. "What are you thinking, Lucas?" he asked gently. Lucas looked up, his eyes reflecting the starlight. "I was thinking about my mom. Do you think she's looking down on me right now?" James felt a lump in his throat. He pulled Lucas close and wrapped an arm around his shoulders. "I believe she is, Lucas. And I think she's very proud of you. Lucas nodded, holding James's hand tightly. And you, James? Do you think your girlfriend is looking down on you too? The question caught James off guard. He swallowed hard, feeling the familiar pain of loss intensify. I think she is, he said, his voice low. And I hope she knows I'm trying to do what's right. That night, after Lucas had fallen asleep, James went to the kitchen where Sarah was reviewing some documents. He sat down beside her, his eyes fixed on the table. He asked about Emily today, he said, his voice choked. I don't know if I'm doing enough. Sarah looked at him with compassion. James, you're doing more than enough. You're giving him something he's never had before. Stability, security, and love. James sighed, running a hand through his hair. It's hard not to feel like I'm failing. Every day is a constant struggle. And I feel like I'm always on the edge. Sarah placed her hand over his, squeezing gently. We're in this together, remember? And no matter what happens, we'll keep fighting. The following days brought new challenges. During a visit from a social worker, Lucas had an emotional breakdown, recalling traumatic moments with his grandfather. James's heart broke seeing the boy so distressed, but he knew it was part of the healing process. He stood by Lucas, holding his hand, offering words of comfort. On a rainy night, James received a call from his lawyer. James, we have a problem. Lucas's grandfather is trying to obtain testimonies that could complicate the case. He's claiming that you're emotionally unstable. James felt anger rising, but he took a deep breath. What can we do? We need more evidence of your commitment and the stability you're providing to Lucas. We'll need testimonies from people close to you, and maybe even from Sarah. When he hung up, he looked at Sarah, who had already grasped the gravity of the conversation. He's trying to destroy us, Sarah. She approached, holding his face in her hands. We won't let him. We'll find a way. I'll give my testimony, and we'll do whatever it takes. The next morning, James and Sarah began gathering testimonies from friends, neighbors, and professionals who had worked with Lucas. Every word of support was a small victory, but uncertainty still loomed over them. One night, as they gathered in the living room, Lucas approached with a drawing in his hands. I made this for you guys, he said timidly. James took the drawing and felt tears fill his eyes. It was a simple drawing but full of love. Him, Sarah, and Lucas holding hands with big smiles on their faces. It's beautiful, Lucas, James said, his voice choked. Lucas smiled, hugging them. I love you guys. James and Sarah looked at each other, feeling a wave of emotions wash over them. Every challenge, every moment of pain and uncertainty was worth it for that moment of love and hope. They knew the fight was far from over, but together, they were ready to face anything. James's life was in a constant state of tension as the battle for Lucas's custody unfolded. Each day was a new emotional roller coaster. Though there were moments of joy and hope, the shadow of Lucas's grandfather loomed over them, threatening the fragile stability James and Sarah were trying to build. One night, as darkness seemed to engulf everything, James sat on the couch, gazing at the dancing flames in the fireplace. Sarah was by his side, going over legal documents, but he could see the concern in her eyes. Lucas had already gone to bed, exhausted after a particularly tough day at school, where he had to deal with painful questions about his family situation. Suddenly, James's phone rang, breaking the heavy silence. He answered quickly, his heart pounding. Hello. It was the lawyer. James, we have a problem. We've received a subpoena for a new emergency hearing. Lucas's grandfather is claiming that you're not providing a safe environment for him. James felt the ground shift beneath his feet. What do you mean? How can he do that? He got a testimony from a neighbor who claims to have heard constant fights in your house. We'll need solid evidence to counter this. James hung up, feeling desperation creeping in. Sarah, he's trying to destroy us. We have a new emergency hearing. Sarah stood up, her face pale with worry but her eyes shining with determination. "We'll face this, James. We'll find a way." The following days were a whirlwind of preparation. They contacted everyone they could to gather testimonies and evidence that Lucas was in a safe and loving environment. But the tension was unbearable. James could hardly sleep, each waking moment filled with the fear of losing Lucas. On the morning of the hearing, the atmosphere was heavy with anxiety. Lucas, sensing the seriousness of the moment, was quiet and introspective. James knelt before him, holding his small hands. "Lucas, I want you to know that no matter what happens today, I'll always be here for you. I'll never give up on you." Lucas nodded, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "I know, James. I believe in you." In the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Lucas's grandfather was present, with a challenging look that made James's blood boil. Testimonies began, and each word felt like a blow. The neighbor gave a testimony that painted a distorted picture of life in James's house, claiming there were constant arguments and an unstable environment. James felt a powerless rage building inside him, but he knew he needed to keep calm. When it was Sarah's turn to speak, she stood up confidently. "I've been with James and Lucas since the beginning of this journey. What I've seen is a man who loves deeply and does everything to provide a safe and loving home for Lucas. The allegations of instability are unfounded." The judge listened attentively, but his face was unreadable. Finally, after what felt like endless hours, he called for a break to deliberate. James left the courtroom, feeling like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. Lucas held his hand, squeezing tightly. "James, do you think we'll win?" Lucas asked, his voice full of fragile hope. James looked at him, tears filling his eyes. "I hope so, Lucas. I'm doing everything I can." When the judge finally returned, the silence in the room was oppressive. "After considering all testimonies and evidence, I've decided that, for now, Lucas will remain under James's temporary custody. However, closer monitoring will be conducted to ensure he's in a safe environment." James felt a wave of relief wash over him, but he knew the battle was far from over. As they left the courthouse, he squeezed Lucas's hand and looked at Sarah. "We've taken another step, but we need to keep fighting." That night, back at the apartment, they sat together on the couch, exhausted but relieved. Lucas nestled between James and Sarah, holding both of their hands. "I love you guys," he said, his voice soft but full of emotion. James felt tears roll down his face as he hugged Lucas tightly. "We love you too, Lucas. And no matter what happens, we'll always be together." James couldn't shake off the feeling of imminent danger, even with the small victory in court. The constant pressure and fear of losing Lucas were overwhelming. He and Sarah tried to maintain Lucas's routine as normal as possible, but the tension was palpable. Lucas, sensitive as ever, felt the stress around him and tried to be strong, but his sadness was evident. One afternoon, while Sarah was in the kitchen preparing dinner and Lucas was drawing in the living room, James received a call from his lawyer. "James, I have bad news. Lucas's grandfather has secured a new hearing to discuss permanent custody. It's in 2 weeks." James felt a chill run down his spine. 2 weeks? Is that enough time to prepare a proper defense? "It's going to be tight, but we have to try. We need to gather more evidence and testimonies. We'll need all the resources we can get." After hanging up, James sat down beside Lucas, who looked at him with his big, curious eyes. "Everything okay, James?" James forced a smile. "Yes, Lucas. We're going to have to fight a little longer, but I'm here with you." That night, while Lucas slept, James and Sarah spent hours discussing strategies. Exhaustion was visible on both their faces, but determination kept them going. "We can't let him take Lucas," Sarah said, her voice full of emotion. "He needs us." James nodded, feeling the same anguish. "We'll do whatever it takes. I won't give up on Lucas." In the following days, James reached out to everyone who could help. He sought testimonies from Lucas's teachers, neighbors, and close friends. Each conversation was a small battle, but every word of support strengthened his resolve. Sarah stood by his side at every step, her unwavering support being the anchor that kept him steady. One night, while reviewing documents, Sarah placed her hand on James's. "You're amazing, you know that? Everything you're doing for Lucas. He's lucky to have you." James looked at her, his eyes filled with gratitude and love. "I couldn't do this without you, Sarah. You're my strength." She smiled, tears shining in her eyes. "And you're mine." When the date of the hearing finally arrived, James felt prepared, but fear still lingered like a shadow. In the courtroom, Lucas's grandfather seemed more determined than ever. James looked at Lucas, who was sitting beside Sarah, and felt a wave of protection and love envelop him. During the hearing, Lucas's grandfather tried to paint a distorted picture of James, claiming he was unfit to care for the boy. Every word felt like a stab in James's heart, but he stood firm, knowing the truth was on his side. When it was James's turn to speak, he stood up and looked directly at the judge. "Lucas is more than a boy to me. He's my son. I've done everything I can to give him a better life, to protect him and love him. And I'll continue to do so, no matter what happens." The judge listened attentively, and when it was Sarah's turn to speak, she reinforced every word of James's with her own passionate testimony. "Lucas has found a family with James. He's found love, security, and hope. To separate them would be a tragic mistake." After hours of testimonies and discussions, the judge retired to deliberate. The wait was agonizing, every minute dragging on like an eternity. James held Lucas's hand, feeling fear and hope mingling in his chest. Finally, the judge returned. The tension in the room was palpable as he began to speak. "After considering all the evidence and testimonies, I've decided that Lucas should remain under James's permanent custody." The judge's words echoed in the room, and James felt a wave of relief so intense that he almost collapsed. He pulled Lucas into a tight hug, tears streaming freely down his face. "We did it, Lucas. We did it." Lucas hugged James tightly, and for the first time in a long time, a genuine smile lit up his face. "I knew you would, James. I knew." In the days following the victory in court, life seemed to finally be stabilizing for James, Sarah, and Lucas. However, the emotional battle was far from over. Lucas, although happy, still carried deep scars from his past, and James knew that true healing would take time. One afternoon, while Sarah was in the kitchen preparing dinner, James and Lucas were in the living room, playing with a puzzle. Suddenly, Lucas looked at James with a serious and vulnerable gaze. "James, do you think my mom would be proud of me?" James felt a tug at his heartstrings. He held Lucas's hand firmly. "I'm sure she would, Lucas. You're an amazing boy, and she would be very proud of you." Lucas smiled, but his eyes still reflected a deep sadness. "Sometimes I miss her. I wish she could see me now." James pulled Lucas into a tight hug, feeling his own tears welling up. "I miss someone very special too, and I know how much it hurts. But I know they're watching over us and they're proud of us." As they embraced, Sarah entered the room, watching the scene with tears in her eyes. She joined the hug, enveloping them both with love and comfort. "We're a family now, and we'll get through this together." As time passed, James realized that Sarah's constant presence in their lives had become essential. She not only helped take care of Lucas, but also offered James an emotional support he had never experienced before. His feelings for her became increasingly clear, but he feared expressing them, worried about complicating their lives even further. On a particularly cold night, while Lucas slept, James and Sarah sat on the balcony, watching the full moon. The silence between them was comfortable but laden with unspoken emotions. Finally, James broke the silence. "Sarah, I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done for us." Sarah smiled, her eyes shining with tenderness. "You don't need to thank me, James. I'm here because I want to be, because I care about you both. James felt his heart race. He looked at Sarah, feeling a wave of courage. I've realized that you're much more than a friend to me. You're my strength, my partner. And I think I'm falling in love with you. Sarah looked at him, surprised and touched. James, I've always felt something for you. Ever since the days when we were friends with Emily. But I never had the courage to say it. They drew closer and James kissed her gently, feeling a peace he hadn't experienced in a long time. When they pulled away, he looked into her eyes and whispered, "We'll face everything together, Sarah. As a family." The news of James and Sarah's relationship brought a new wave of hope for Lucas. He watched them with a shy smile, happy to see the people he loved finding happiness together. The new dynamic brought more stability and joy to their home, but it also raised new questions and challenges. One night, while Sarah was reading a story to Lucas, he looked at her with a serious expression. "Sarah, do you think we can be a real family? Like the ones we see in movies?" Sarah closed the book and looked at Lucas affectionately. "We already are a real family, Lucas. But if you're asking about marriage, well, that's something James and I need to talk about." Lucas nodded with a shy smile. "I would like that. Very much." Later that night, after Lucas had fallen asleep, Sarah told James about her conversation with Lucas. James was pensive, feeling the seriousness of the situation. "I love you, Sarah, and I want us to be a real family, for Lucas and for us." Sarah smiled, her eyes shining with tears. "I love you too, James, and nothing would make me happier." The next morning, James took Sarah and Lucas for a walk in the park. They walked together, enjoying the sun and the gentle breeze. Finally, James knelt in front of Sarah, with Lucas by his side, and held her hand. "Sarah, will you make me the happiest man in the world and marry me? Let's be a family forever." Sarah looked at James, then at Lucas, who looked at her expectantly. With tears in her eyes and a radiant smile, she answered, "Yes, James. I want to spend the rest of my life with you both." They hugged each other, while Lucas jumped for joy around them. The happiness they felt was indescribable. In that moment, James felt that all their struggles, all the sleepless nights, and all the challenges they faced had been worth it. As they walked back home hand in hand, James looked at the sky and whispered a silent gratitude. The wedding preparations brought a wave of joy and hope for everyone, but also painful memories and unexpected challenges. As Sarah and James prepared to officially join their lives, they were both confronted by shadows from the past. One afternoon, while Sarah tried on her wedding dress, Lucas sat in the waiting area of the shop, drawing. James watched the scene with a smile on his face, but a latent anxiety in his heart. It was hard not to remember Emily, their dreams together, and the wedding that never happened. He found himself gazing out the window, lost in thought. Sarah, noticing James' distant expression, approached and touched his shoulder. "James, are you okay?" He blinked, returning to reality. "Yeah, I am. Just thinking." She smiled understandingly. "I know this brings back a lot of memories, but know that Emily would be happy for you, for us." James held Sarah's hand, feeling the truth in her words, but the pain of loss was still sharp. "I just want us all to be okay. For Lucas to be okay." Sarah nodded, her eyes full of love. "He's getting better every day. And it's because of you." On the night before the wedding, while Lucas slept in the guest room, James and Sarah sat on the balcony, gazing at the stars. The silence between them was comfortable but laden with unspoken emotions. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. "James, are you ready for tomorrow?" He looked at her, his heart racing. "Yeah, I am. But I'm also nervous. What if I can't protect you and Lucas? What if I fail again?" Sarah took his hand, squeezing it tightly. "James, you're not alone. We're in this together. And I trust you. We'll face everything together, as we always have." He looked at her, feeling a wave of gratitude and love. I love you, Sarah, and I promise I'll do everything in my power to be the husband and father you both deserve." On the day of the wedding, the sun shone brightly, as if even the sky was celebrating their union. Lucas, dressed in a small suit, looked radiant with happiness. As Sarah walked down the aisle, James felt a wave of emotions. Tears filled his eyes as he saw her, so beautiful and radiant. He knew that this was the beginning of a new life, a life he never imagined possible after so much pain. During the ceremony, as they exchanged vows, James looked into Sarah's eyes and felt all barriers fall away. "Sarah, I promise to love you and Lucas with all my heart. I promise to be your support, your strength, and your family forever." Sarah, with tears in her eyes, replied, "James, I promise to stand by your side in every moment, good and bad. I promise to love you and Lucas with all that I am. And together we'll build a life full of love and hope." After the wedding, they gathered for a small reception with close friends and family. Lucas ran up to James and Sarah, hugging them tightly. "Now we're a real family." James smiled, feeling his heart overflow with joy. "Yes, Lucas, we're a real family." As the night progressed, James stepped away from the party for a moment, gazing at the starry sky. He felt a presence beside him and turned to see Lucas. "What are you doing here, big guy?" James asked with a smile. "I wanted to tell you something," Lucas replied, his voice serious. "I know you miss your girlfriend, and I miss my mom, but I'm glad you and Sarah are with me, and I know they're happy too." James felt tears streaming down his face. He hugged Lucas tightly, feeling a mixture of pain and joy. "I'm glad too, Lucas, and I promise I'll always be here for you. Always." Lucas looked at the sky and whispered, "Good night, Mom." "Good night, Emily." James followed Lucas' gaze, feeling an unexpected peace. He knew that wherever they were, Emily and Lucas' mother would be watching over them with pride and love. In the months following the wedding, James, Sarah, and Lucas' lives began to settle into a sense of normalcy, a calmness that had long seemed unattainable. However, their journey was still far from free of challenges. One afternoon, while Lucas was at school, James received a call from the hospital. "Mr. James, your grandfather has been brought in. He's in critical condition." James felt a chill run down his spine. Despite all the problems Lucas' grandfather had caused, he was still part of the boy's painful past. James knew he had to deal with this, not just for Lucas, but also to close a chapter of their lives. He went to the hospital and found Lucas' grandfather unconscious, hooked up to various machines. He felt a mix of anger and pity. This man had caused so much suffering, but here he lay, looking so frail and human. The doctors informed him that he didn't have much time left. Back home, James sat with Sarah and explained the situation. "I don't know how to tell Lucas. He deserves to know, but I don't want it to hurt him even more." Sarah placed her hand on his. "Let's tell him the truth, but together. He's strong and he has us." When Lucas returned from school, he sensed the tension in the air. James and Sarah sat him down on the couch and carefully explained the situation. "Lucas, your grandfather is in the hospital. He's very sick and may not have much time." Lucas listened in silence, his eyes wide and filled with sadness. "Can we go see him?" James nodded. "Yes, we can." At the hospital, Lucas entered his grandfather's room with hesitant steps. The man who had often scared him now seemed small and vulnerable. Lucas approached the bed and held his hand, his eyes filled with tears. "Grandpa, I wish you had been different." James and Sarah remained silent, respecting the moment. Lucas continued, his voice trembling, "But I forgive you, and I hope you find peace." James felt tears rolling down his face. Lucas' maturity and forgiveness were incredible. They left the hospital, knowing that moment had been an important step in Lucas' healing. In the days that followed, Lucas seemed more introspective but also more at peace. He talked with James and Sarah about his feelings, something that had seemed impossible before. One night, as they sat together in the living room, Lucas looked at James and Sarah with a shy smile. "I think my mom and Emily are happy for us." James hugged Lucas, feeling a wave of emotions. "I'm sure they are, Lucas. And they're very proud of you." Time passed, and the new family found ways to celebrate life and create new memories. One afternoon, while at the park, Lucas saw a girl playing alone. He approached her and started talking. James and Sarah watched from afar, smiling at how Lucas was growing up and becoming such a generous and friendly boy. When they returned home, Lucas told them that the girl Lily had recently lost her mother. "She was sad, so I told her she could play with us anytime." James and Sarah were impressed by Lucas' empathy. They decided to invite Lily and her father, Mark, for dinner. It was an evening filled with laughter and new friendships. As Lily and Lucas played, James and Sarah talked with Mark, discovering shared stories and experiences of loss and overcoming. Later that night, after Lily and Mark had left, Lucas approached James and Sarah. "I like having friends. I like our family. And I like helping others." James smiled, feeling deeply grateful. "You have an incredible heart, Lucas. And we're very proud of you." As the night wore on, James, Sarah, and Lucas sat together on the porch, looking at the stars. James felt an inner peace he hadn't experienced in a long time. He knew their journey would still have its challenges, but with Sarah and Lucas by his side, he was ready for anything. Lucas laid his head on James' shoulder, sighing happily. "Good night, Dad." "Good night, Mom." James and Sarah exchanged glances, tears glistening in their eyes. "Good night, son," James whispered, feeling love and hope fill his heart. As time passed, the new routine of James, Sarah, and Lucas settled into a new normalcy filled with love and hope. However, life, with its surprises and challenges, never ceased to test even the strongest. One morning, as everyone was getting ready for a sunny picnic day, James received an unexpected call. It was from the hospital, informing him that Lucas' grandfather had passed away overnight. James felt his heart tighten, knowing that despite everything, Lucas would need to face yet another blow. He sat down beside Lucas, who was enthusiastically helping pack the snacks. "Lucas, I need to tell you something," he said softly. "Your grandfather, he passed away last night." Lucas' smile vanished, replaced by an expression of profound sadness. "He's gone?" Lucas asked, his voice trembling. James nodded, holding Lucas' small hands. "Yes, he's gone. I know he wasn't easy for you, but he was your grandfather." Lucas remained silent for a long time, tears silently streaming down his face. Sarah joined them, wrapping Lucas in a comforting hug. "I'm here with you," she whispered. Lucas finally found his voice. "I didn't want him to die like this. I wished he had been better." James felt his heart ache, but he knew Lucas' words held a wisdom beyond his years. "I know, Lucas, and you were very brave to forgive him. It shows how big your heart is." They spent the rest of the day quietly together, dealing with the loss in subtle ways. Later, Lucas asked to visit his grandfather's grave. At the cemetery, he stood facing the headstone, holding hands with James and Sarah. "Goodbye, Grandpa. I hope you find peace." With time, the wounds began to heal, and life went on. James and Sarah strove to ensure that Lucas had a childhood filled with love and happiness. They continued to support Lily and her father, Mark, and the friendship between Lucas and Lily blossomed. One afternoon, as James and Sarah watched Lucas and Lily playing in the garden, Sarah took James' hand and smiled. "We really did it, didn't we?" James looked at her, feeling deeply grateful. "Yes, we did. And we still have so much more ahead of us." They decided it was time for a new family adventure and planned a trip to the beach. Lucas had never seen the ocean, and his excitement was contagious. On the day of the trip, as they drove along the coastal road, Lucas couldn't contain his excitement. When they finally arrived, Lucas ran onto the sand, laughing and playing in the waves. James and Sarah sat under a beach umbrella, watching with smiles on their faces. "He's so happy," Sarah said, tears of happiness in her eyes. "He deserves all the happiness in the world," James replied, feeling the warmth of the sun and the love of his family around him. Later at sunset, they took a walk along the beach. Lucas ran ahead, picking up shells and proudly showing each one. At one point, he turned to James and Sarah, his eyes shining with newfound understanding. "You know, I think Mom and Emily are happy for us. They're watching us and smiling." James felt tears fill his eyes. "I think so too, Lucas. They're always with us." They sat together on the sand, watching the sun disappear below the horizon. James held Sarah and Lucas, feeling a deep peace. He looked out at the sea and whispered, "Thank you, Emily. Thank you for guiding us here." That night, back at the hotel, Lucas fell asleep quickly, exhausted but happy. James and Sarah stayed awake a little longer, talking about the future and their dreams. They knew that, despite all the challenges, they had found something precious. A family united by love and resilience. As the moon shone in the night sky, James felt a calmness he hadn't experienced in a long time. He knew the journey would still have its ups and downs, but with Sarah and Lucas by his side, he was ready to face anything. And in that moment, with the sea breeze whispering through the window and the gentle sound of waves in the background, James knew he had finally found the home he had long searched for. A home where love prevailed, where the wounds of the past began to heal, and where the future was filled with hope and new possibilities. They were together, and that was all that mattered. The trip to the beach was a significant milestone for James, Sarah, and Lucas, providing a moment of serenity and connection that they all needed. However, just like the tide, life brought new waves of challenges. A few months after their return, Sarah began to feel tired and unwell. Initially, they attributed this to stress and the busy pace of life, but it soon became clear that something was wrong. Worried, James insisted that Sarah see a doctor. After a series of tests, they received the devastating news. Sarah had a tumor. The diagnosis hit James like a bomb, leaving him stunned and Lucas confused and scared. However, Sarah, with her usual strength, decided to face the illness with courage. "We'll get through this together," she said, holding James's hand firmly. "No matter what happens, I'm ready to fight." James felt his heart break, but he knew he needed to be strong for Sarah and Lucas. "We're by your side, Sarah. Always." The weeks that followed were tough. Sarah started treatment and the side effects soon became evident. There were days when she could barely get out of bed, but even in those moments she tried to keep her spirits up. Lucas, with his characteristic sensitivity, noticed everything. "Mom is going to be okay, right, Dad?" he asked one night as they sat on the couch. James swallowed hard, struggling to keep his voice steady. "We're doing everything we can to make sure she's okay, Lucas. And she's very strong." One afternoon, when Sarah was at the hospital for a chemotherapy session, James took Lucas for a walk in the park. Sitting on a bench, Lucas looked at James with tear-filled eyes. "I'm scared, Dad." James felt tears streaming down his own face. "I am too, son. But we're in this together. And we'll support Mom with everything we've got." Lucas nodded, hugging James tightly. "I'll be strong for her. Like you are." When they returned home, Sarah was waiting for them. Although visibly tired, her smile was genuine. "How was the outing?" Lucas ran to her, hugging her tightly. "It was good, Mom. I love you." Sarah stroked Lucas's hair, her eyes filled with tenderness. "I love you too, my dear. And I'll fight every day to be here with you." The weeks turned into months, and the treatment began to show signs of success. Sarah had some better days, and in those moments, the family clung to every moment of joy and normalcy. One night, while they were all in bed, Lucas suggested they make a wish list, things they wanted to do together once Sarah got better. Sarah and James agreed, and together, they began to dream of trips, adventures, and simple moments of happiness. Lucas carefully wrote his part of the list. I want to go to an amusement park, camp under the stars, and see Mom smile every day. James felt tears threatening to fall again. We'll make each of these wishes come true, Lucas. I promise. Over time, Sarah began to regain her strength. The news that the tumor was shrinking brought a wave of relief and hope. James knew the fight wasn't over yet, but seeing Sarah's smile and Lucas's happiness made it all worthwhile. They decided to celebrate with a small party at home, inviting close friends and family. During the celebration, Lucas raised a toast. To our family, and to Mom, who is the bravest person I know. Sarah was moved, holding James's hand. To our family, she repeated, her voice choked with emotion. And to the love that keeps us together. That night, after all the guests had left, James, Sarah, and Lucas sat together in the living room, watching a movie and laughing at the funny scenes. It was a simple night but full of meaning. They knew that no matter what challenges they might still face, they were together, supporting each other. Later, while Lucas slept, James and Sarah stood on the balcony, watching the stars. Sarah rested her head on James's shoulder. I couldn't have done this without you, she said softly. James kissed the top of her head, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. And I couldn't have done any of this without you. You're my strength, Sarah. And you always will be. They stood in silence, just enjoying each other's presence. The battle against the illness had been tough, but it had also strengthened the love and bond between them. James looked up at the starry sky and whispered a silent prayer of thanks. As the night wore on and the world around them quieted down, James held Sarah's hand, feeling the steady beat of her heart. He knew that no matter what the future might bring, they would face it together as a family. Time passed, and life began to settle into a more tranquil and steady rhythm. Sarah continued to recover, gaining strength with each passing day. James and Lucas remained committed to fulfilling the wishes on their list, each activity bringing moments of pure joy and unity. On a sunny weekend, they decided to go on a camping trip, something Lucas had mentioned several times. They loaded the car with gear, food, and plenty of enthusiasm. The journey was filled with laughter and stories, and Lucas's excitement was contagious. Upon arriving at the site, they set up the tent together, working as a team and savoring every moment. As night fell, they lit a campfire and gathered around it, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories under the starry sky. James looked at Lucas, who was amazed by the vastness of the night sky. This is incredible, Dad, said Lucas, his eyes shining with the light of the stars and the fire. I've never seen so many stars before. James smiled, feeling a wave of emotions. It truly is wonderful, Lucas, and I'm so glad to be here with you and Mom. Sarah, sitting beside James, took his and Lucas's hands, joining them together. We're all here together. That's what matters. That night, before going to bed, Lucas asked to take a walk to a nearby lake, something he had seen on the way. James and Sarah agreed, and together, they walked in silence along the moonlit trail. When they reached the lake, they were awestruck by its serenity and beauty. Lucas picked up a small stone and threw it into the water, watching the ripples spread. I wanted to make a wish, he said, his voice soft. I wish that we would always be together and happy like this. James felt tears welling up. Me too, Lucas. And we'll do everything we can to make that happen. As they walked back to the tent, James couldn't help but feel grateful for every little moment, every shared breath. He knew that despite all the hardships, they had built something strong and beautiful together. One morning, a few weeks after the camping trip, while Sarah was in the kitchen preparing breakfast and Lucas was in the living room drawing, James received a phone call. It was from the lawyer, a familiar voice that brought a mix of anxiety and anticipation. James, I have some important news for you, said the lawyer. The adoption papers have finally been approved. Lucas is officially your son. James felt his heart racing. Tears began to fall before he could fully process the information. "Thank you," was all he managed to say before hanging up. He rushed to the living room, where Lucas was engrossed in his drawing. "Lucas, I have some very important news for you," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. Lucas looked at him, curious. "What is it, Dad?" James knelt beside Lucas, holding his small hands. "The adoption papers have been approved. You are officially my son now." Tears filled Lucas's eyes as he jumped into James's arms. "Really, Dad? I'm your real son." James held Lucas tightly, tears flowing freely. "Yes, Lucas. Really. You are my son." Sarah, upon hearing the news, ran to join them, enveloping them both in a warm embrace. "We're a family forever." That night, they decided to celebrate with a special dinner at home. Lucas helped prepare the food, putting all his enthusiasm and joy into every detail. Sitting at the table, they toasted to the new chapter of their lives, a moment none of them would ever forget. Later, after Lucas had fallen asleep, James and Sarah stood on the balcony, their hearts full of gratitude and love. "We did it, James," Sarah said softly. "He is officially our son." James looked at her, feeling a wave of love so intense it was almost overwhelming. "I couldn't have done this without you, Sarah. You are my strength and my light." They hugged, feeling the calm of the night around them. In that moment, James knew that no matter what the future might bring, they would face it together, as they always had. They had found a peace and happiness that once seemed impossible, and they were ready for anything. As the gentle breeze passed through the balcony, James looked up at the starry sky and whispered a silent prayer of thanks. They were a family, united by love and determination, and that, more than anything else, was the true victory.